Hi, it's Global Politics with Jim Martin. I was watching the news the other day and I heard that Admiral Keith Kellogg, who is President Trump's special envoy to Ukraine, mentioned that he is of or from the School of Realism. And periodically you'll hear politicians and foreign affairs people say that. It doesn't mean what folks think it does. And I thought I would clarify what realism means in that context. For most of us, realism would suggest I'm a pragmatic, practical person. I'm headed out into the world to try to solve some problems and do these kinds of things. It actually means something entirely different. Realism is a political philosophy that is born from Machiavelli, the prince. And I try not to get too wonky on here, so I'm going to avoid that when I can. Machiavelli is all about power and position and doing to others before they can do it to you. Not the greatest moral guy in the world. And he's kind of the origin story of modern realism. I'm going to distinguish this from some of the people I'm going to talk about are theorists or philosophers, Machiavelli being one who was a little bit of both, advisor and philosopher. The other people I'm talking about are people who believe this as a philosophy and carry it out into the world and practice it, which is somewhat different. So Machiavelli, kind of a little bit of both, advisor, yet also a foreign affairs statesman advisor sort to the prince in this case. The next person that comes to mind when we think about realism is a guy from the Austro-Hungarian Empire named von Metternich. And he was sort of their foreign affairs guy, ambassador types. They didn't have as formal a title back then. And essentially what he was looking to do was to maximize the advantage of Austro-Hungary and to punish adversaries and to balance against potential adversaries. And so he saw every country as a potential adversary. In the moment, these are our enemies, these could be our allies against them. And so they would have this constantly shifting sort of alliance structure to balance against whomever was the biggest power around. Could be Russia at that time, could have been Prussia. There wasn't a Germany in his time. This is like the 1700s. So he was very successful at this sort of shifting alliance structure. Another one would be the German general von Clausewitz. He has a famous book on war. He was very much an advocate of that, okay, so our enemy is weak now, strike and punish them. But perhaps in 5 years' time, our enemy today might be somebody that we want to ally with to balance against somebody else. The character of these regimes and the people leading them, and whether or not they were democracies or not, by the way, there were almost no democracies in Europe, or not even like what we would think of as a democracy at that time. It was all about that. It's about balancing your power against other states. What they do within those states is none of your problem. It's all about the power side of things. There were kind of three central figures that played a role in the practice of realism as a means of conducting foreign affairs in the United States that I like to talk about. First is George Kennan, who was at the time working in the CIA, and he wrote a treatise anonymously discussing how the United States should reconfigure their foreign policy towards the then Soviet Union. So this is in the 50s, and he is well known for his treatise on containment, or the idea that we must work with other countries to prevent the spread of communism. And what those other countries do or are is not our problem at all. because it's about the power of the United States and balancing against the power of the Soviet Union, using whatever countries that we can. Kissinger was another proponent of this, and you can see it in practice when Kissinger made entreaties to then communist China, which was a staunch adversary of the United States and indeed and somewhat of an active participant in the Vietnam War, in that they were supplying weapons and training and such to the North Vietnamese. He made some outreach to communist China, which was as closed off as it could possibly be from the United States at that time, to create a wedge between China and Russia. Russia being the primary supplier of weapons, support, and training, even sometimes personnel in the form of pilots, to the North Vietnamese in an effort to ultimately end that war. They were all people who were like, we have a brutal dictatorship under the reign of the Shah of Iran. No big deal to us if they're anti-communist. We have correspondingly a dictatorship in the form of Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Okay, we can work with that. This is the kind of attitude a realist practitioner of foreign policy would take. There's no morals. It's actually amoral. It's all about power. It's all about preserving stability while maximizing your own power. Another example of this would be Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was kind of floating around in the late 70s, early 80s, had a lot to do with how the United States engaged with Pakistan, Israel, and Saudi Arabia in terms of countering the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. To hear Keith Kellogg say this really was an interesting moment for me, in that it really kind of casts things back. And something I've been thinking about quite a bit is that the foreign policy of the United States is no longer about interdependence and globalization. It's about maximizing United States economic and military power, if necessary, to counter what it perceives to be its adversaries. That means that you don't have any friends. You have alliances of convenience that may or may not be sustained for the long term. The recent NATO conference, NATO Security Conference, it really underlined that. The remarks of Pete Hegseth and Vice President Vance underscore the fact that it won't be very long before the United States is no longer a real partner to the Europeans. Sadly, what this harkens back to is a pre-World War I world full of short, sharp, deadly conflicts and a lot more authoritarianism. Sorry to have that sad message for you today, but I hope you got something out of this. If you have any comments, please leave them down below, and I look forward to talking to you on the next one. Thanks.